Hey there, viewers. Once the footage is out, no amount of begging can undo what's been seen. Today, after new prison video surfaced, Diddy stood before the judge, pleading for mercy, but by then, it was already too late. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. The Man Who Wouldn't Sleep. I didn't ask to be transferred to SHU. Nobody ever does. In a place like MDC Brooklyn, working the special housing unit at night is like volunteering to stare too long into something you can't ever unsee. I used to run the lower units, mostly easy runs. Check-ins, light paperwork, catching guys sneaking extra commissary packs or trying to hide a blunt under their bunks. Nothing like what waited on the 4th floor. Nothing like what waited behind Diddy's door. The first night they posted me outside his cell, I thought it was going to be easy. Celebrity inmates usually either break quick or play it low. Either way, they're usually not a problem. But Diddy wasn't like the others, not anymore. From the start, you could tell the man wasn't sleeping. I mean, really think about that. Every time I walked past his slot during rounds, I'd hear the soft scrape of his feet pacing that little 12-foot strip of concrete. Sometimes he'd hum under his breath, low and tuneless, like a broken machine trying to remember a song. Sometimes it was just muttering, words too fast and jumbled to catch, and sometimes those were the worst nights. He'd just stand there in the middle of the room, staring dead into the corner like he was waiting for something to crawl out of it. They didn't tell me to watch him close. They didn't have to. After 3 nights of hearing him whisper at walls, you start watching on your own. First it was curiosity, then it was something closer to fear. He never laid down, not once. I don't know how his body held up. Most guys, after a few days of SHU isolation, they either snap or sleep 18 hours a day. Not him. It was like he knew something was coming and he couldn't afford to close his eyes. The other guards had a nickname for him, the Night Walker. I thought it was cruel at first. Then I started to understand. By the end of the first week, I was noticing little things that started to mess with me more than the big stuff ever could. I'd find scraps of something on the floor outside his door. At first, I thought it was food, but it wasn't. It was toothpaste, smeared out and dried into rough patterns on torn pieces of fabric. Later, coffee grounds, dabbed and smeared into symbols I didn't recognize. Not letters, not anything I could read. More like maps drawn by someone who forgot what maps were supposed to look like. One night, while I was supposed to be doing my paperwork, I saw him pulling his mattress off the frame. Quiet, slow, like he thought the concrete itself might be listening. He took one of those scraps, folded into a triangle, and taped it to the underside of the mattress using strips torn from his jumpsuit. I didn't report it. I should have, but part of me didn't want to. Part of me didn't want to know what would happen if someone touched whatever he was building down there. There were rumors even among the guards, not official ones. You'd only hear it when the shift dragged too late and the coffee went cold. Guys said Diddy wasn't alone. They said he had watchers inside. Not guards, not cameras, other inmates. Eyes planted on every tier, passing messages nobody ever caught, slipping warnings through the ventilation shafts and cracked concrete seams. One guy said he heard a tapping in the pipes one night after Diddy was moved. He said it wasn't random, said it was a pattern. I wanted to laugh it off. I really did. But then the flicker happened. It was a Tuesday, about 2 in the morning, the kind of dead hour when even the nightmares settle down for a minute. I was doing a slow walk past Diddy's cell, just glancing in through the little reinforced window. He was pacing, same as always, shirt off, pants hanging loose, muttering under his breath. Sweat streaked his face, and his hands kept twitching at his sides like he was ready to throw a punch but didn't know at what. Then, just as I passed his door, the hallway lights flickered. Not a power cut, not the usual MDC brownout stutter. This was different. The The lights pulsed one long, slow blink, and everything went dead silent for half a second. And Diddy stopped moving. Mid-step, one foot still hanging in the air like he'd frozen in place, his head tilted slightly to the side, listening. His whole body locked up like he'd been caught in a flash freeze. And he waited, not a flinch, not a breath too heavy, just absolute, unnatural stillness, staring at the far corner of his cell. I don't know how long it lasted. Could have been 3 seconds, could have been 30. When the lights popped back, buzzing overhead, he didn't jump or blink. He just changed direction, slow and deliberate, and started pacing again. Like whatever message he was waiting for had been delivered. I stood there longer than I should have, heart hammering in my ribs. I told myself it was nothing, a glitch, a coincidence. A man losing his mind from too many nights locked away from the world. But it didn't feel like nothing. It felt like watching someone follow orders you couldn't hear. I wasn't the only one who noticed. The next morning during shift change, one of the old guards, Jackson, been around since the late 90s, pulled me aside. He didn't say much, just clapped a heavy hand on my shoulder and said, "If you see the lights blink again, son, you don't look. You keep walking." I didn't ask questions, not after the look in his eyes. After that night, things started to fray at the edges. Tiny things, easy to miss unless you were looking too hard. Diddy's jumpsuit got replaced more often than made sense. His mattress changed twice in a week, unheard of in Shoe. Once, I caught a glimpse through the slot when they swapped it out. A dark stain smeared across the frame underneath, like someone had written and then scrubbed it clean, scrubbed too hard. I started dreading rounds, not because Diddy ever attacked or screamed or fought. He never did. It was worse than that. It was the feeling that every time I walked past that door, he was seeing something I couldn't, hearing instructions that were coming from somewhere deeper than this building. The other inmates avoided his tier, even the ones who didn't know who he was. They knew better. Some smells get into your bones before your brain catches up. There were nights, toward the end of my first month, when I'd find myself slowing down outside his door without meaning to, watching him pace, watching him stop sometimes and whisper to the crack between the floor and the wall, soft, frantic words I could never quite make out. And every time the lights so much as flickered, even just a hum or a buzz, I'd feel that knot in my gut start to tighten. One night, I don't even know why I did it, I stayed a few seconds longer at his window. I watched him crouch down by his bunk, peel back the mattress again and press his forehead to whatever was taped underneath. It wasn't prayer, it didn't feel like that. It felt like and for just a breath, I swear to you, I saw his lips move. A single phrase repeated twice, maybe 3 times. No sound, but the shape of the words stuck with me. And still waiting. Still waiting for what, or for who? I never found out. I didn't want to. Not really. Some things in places like this aren't meant for the guards. They're meant for the cracks in the walls. They're meant for the places no one records. And Diddy, he wasn't just serving time, he was preparing for something. That was the worst part. He wasn't broken. He was building. Chapter 2, The Outgoing Line. I got the assignment 2 months after the first real rumors about him started picking up speed. To be honest, I didn't want it. Monitoring MDC Brooklyn was supposed to be a step down, an easy post compared to some of the active cases I'd worked before. High-profile inmate, high-profile caution, sure, but we weren't expecting anything complicated, just routine communications, surveillance, monitoring calls, reading letters, checking monitored emails. Every inmate had a file. Every file had a list of authorized contacts, call durations, content flags, and review requirements. The system was built to catch mistakes before they happened. Key words would trigger automatic flags: violence, drugs, escape, threats. Anomalies got escalated to supervisors. It was supposed to be airtight, and yet from the beginning there was something about Diddy's line that didn't fit. I first noticed it during a basic review sweep. His call logs showed a perfect routine. Short check-ins with his legal team, scheduled family calls that barely lasted 10 minutes, a couple messages passed through his attorneys. On paper, it was boring. Almost too boring. The blank spots were the first clue, gaps in the metadata that shouldn't have been there. Not full deletions, no, that would have been too obvious. Instead, the system showed timestamps where a call supposedly started, ran for 20 or 30 minutes, and then closed out, without any corresponding recording file attached. No audio, no transcript, no technical error reports. Just a ghost line. At first, I figured it was a glitch. Our infrastructure at MDC wasn't exactly NASA-grade. Half the surveillance servers were running on outdated software patched together with last year's budgets. But the more I dug, the worse it looked. These gaps weren't random. They clustered around certain days, always after sundown, always during second shift rotation, when there were fewer eyes on the security decks. The first 3 blanks I flagged and logged the regular way. Filled out the QA forms, filed the missing recording tickets, moved on. But after the 4th one, my supervisor called me into his office. He didn't yell. He didn't even sound mad. He just closed the door, leaned back in his chair, and said, "Drop it. Too many glitches to chase. Focus on live patterns." When I asked why no one else seemed concerned, he smiled a tired smile and said, "You'll understand one day. Not everything that slips through needs to be chased." It was a polite warning, a subtle one, but it stuck. I still had a job to do, and as much as they wanted me to look away, I couldn't unsee the patterns now. I started marking the gaps differently in my personal notes, small red dots on my shift calendars, right where the blanks happened. At first, it just looked like scattered dust, but by the end of 3 weeks, the dots formed a pattern. Every third night, always between 2:00 a.m. and 4:00 a.m., always after a known attorney-clerk privileged call was scheduled, almost as if piggybacking on authorized access points. Someone was helping him, either someone inside MDC or someone bigger than that. It gnawed at me. Around that same time, I started hearing the music. It wasn't music in the way you normally think of it. No melodies, no lyrics. It was more like sound, warped and low, almost like something mechanical, trying to hum itself into a lullaby. It would bleed through during the blank periods, faint enough that I thought I was imagining it at first. When I ran diagnostics on my headset, everything came back clean. No crossfeed, no interference, but there it was. A slow droning hum rising and falling behind the empty noise. The first time I caught a clear piece, I ran it through an audio cleaner. Underneath the noise, there was a pattern. Reversed notes, scratched violins, something ancient, ceremonial, almost like an old hymn played backward on broken equipment. It made my stomach turn. Not because it was loud. It wasn't. It was the shape of it. The way it felt like it was pulling at the edges of the room around me, pressing into places sound wasn't supposed to go. I printed the cleaned audio spectrum and clipped it inside my notebook. I knew better than to upload it to the work servers. And still, officially there was nothing wrong. The supervisors pretended the missing logs didn't exist. The system checks kept coming back clean. And every day, Diddy's official records grew fatter with nothing. A man with everything to lose, saying nothing, reaching no one. Except, he wasn't reaching no one. He was reaching something. The night I finally heard it clearly was the night I almost quit. It was around 2:30 a.m. I was alone in the monitoring room, standard skeleton crew rotation. I had Diddy's live call log open, not expecting anything. But there it was again. An active line with no attached source, a timestamp ticking upward. And in my headset, under the hum of dead air, a voice began to emerge. Not words, not really. I'll work. A cadence, a whisper in reverse, looping over itself. I ripped the headset off so fast it nearly broke the wire. Then whatever was happening wasn't just about lawyer calls or prison privileges. It was something deeper, something that slipped through the cracks of normal procedure, something the walls themselves didn't want reported. After that night, I tried to distance myself. I stopped looking too hard at the gaps. I stopped asking about the old call logs. I stopped chasing the humming noise that sometimes bled out of the speakers when no one else was around to hear it. But the pattern stayed, and with it the knowledge that someone or something was moving messages out of MDC Brooklyn, right under our noses. Sometimes I wondered if anyone else heard it too. Sometimes I caught the other texts glancing up when the speakers buzzed or the lines hissed, but none of us said a word. You learned fast in that room. Silence kept you safe. I didn't think about who might be on the other end of those blank calls. Not really. It was easier not to. Easier to believe it was lawyers or managers or terrified friends trying to help him hold on to what little reputation he had left. But late at night, when the monitors flickered and the old pipes moaned through the floorboards, I wondered if the music was a message. Wondered if it was a warning. And most of all, I wondered if we weren't just monitoring a man inside a prison. I wondered if we were helping him build a door to walk right out of it. Chapter 3. The Visitor They Denied. You learn early on working at MDC Brooklyn that most of your job isn't in the paperwork or the phone calls. It's in what you pretend not to hear, what you don't ask about, what you file under "not my problem" and move on from. I was just a mid-level admin, tucked into a back office near the intake processing wing. My job was to shuffle paperwork, visiting schedules, custody transfers, intake logs, nothing glamorous, nothing dangerous, until Diddy showed up. They didn't make a big deal out of it at first. Celebrity or not, he was another inmate with a number and a cell assignment. A little extra security around his tier, sure. A few more memos about discretion and sensitive materials handling. But for the most part, it was business as usual. Until that morning. It was a Wednesday, cold and gray and unremarkable. I had a stack of visitor clearance forms to log into the database, a mindless job if there ever was one. I worked through them slow, sipping lukewarm coffee, fighting off the sleep that came with long hours in windowless rooms. That's when I noticed the gap. It wasn't obvious at first, just a small break in the visitor chain. The list for shoe visits was usually airtight. Pre-cleared attorneys, tightly vetted family members under heavy surveillance. But right there, nestled between two approved entries, was a missing file ID. A hole where a visit should have been logged. No name, no timestamp, just an empty bracket. I flagged it mentally but didn't think much of it at first. System glitches weren't exactly rare. But when I pulled up the security stills for that morning's visitation, something we cross-reference for any log corrections, that's when the itch at the back of my neck started. The footage was grainy, low-res, nothing unusual. Visitors in line, pat-downs at the checkpoint, slow shuffling through the steel gates. But there, tucked between two regular visitor groups, was a woman I didn't recognize. She wasn't dressed like the others, no jeans or sweaters, no bulky coats. She wore a long, dark veil that draped over her face and shoulders, thin enough to make her features blurry, thick enough to keep her identity hidden. Her ID badge, supposed to be prominently displayed, was nowhere to be seen. Her hands stayed tucked under the veil, clutching something small and boxy against her stomach. When the guards patted her down, they barely touched her. A casual swipe of the arms, nothing more. No secondary inspection, no metal detector beeping, no notes of irregularities in the logs. I leaned closer to the screen, trying to get a better look, but the footage distorted right at the moment she crossed the threshold into shoe access. A pulse of static. Then gone. She shouldn't have been there. No record, no authorization, no name. I made the mistake of mentioning it to a colleague later that afternoon, half joking. I framed it as a glitch, laughed it off like it was nothing. The look she gave me shut me up fast. She leaned in, voice low, and said, "You don't talk about that, not even here." When I pressed, she just shook her head and muttered, "Ask the old-timers." I waited until after shift change, when the older guards gathered near the vending machines, trading stories and stale coffee between rounds. I lingered close enough to listen without drawing attention. One of them, Jackson, the same guy who everyone said had been working MDC since before the new wings were built, was in the middle of a story about Diddy's behavior. Nothing unusual, just the typical SHU gossip. But then another guard, a wiry guy with a smoker's cough, cut in. "Man still got friends," he said, flicking ash into a styrofoam cup. "Old world friends. You think they just let him rot in there without making moves?" Someone else snickered. "Heard he had a visitor last week. One they didn't log." Jackson just grunted. "Yeah, heard that too." Then the wiry guy said it, half laughing, half dead serious. "Bet you anything that's who Oprah sent." The laughter that followed wasn't natural. It was too forced, too brittle, the kind of laugh you use when you're trying not to think too hard about something. Nobody corrected him. Nobody denied it. Just nervous chuckles and eyes that didn't meet. Didn't know what to make of it. Some kind of high-level visit, damage control, someone sent to remind him of who he owed, what he needed to keep quiet about. Or maybe it wasn't damage control at all. Maybe it was a warning. Later that night, I pulled up the raw door access logs, not the polished visitor lists we used for admin reports, the real logs, the ones only certain staff had clearance for. I wasn't supposed to have access, but sometimes you learn how to slide through the cracks in places like this. The entry timestamp for Shoegate 4 showed an override code. Manual entry authorization, no staff ID attached. In simple terms, someone inside let that visitor through without official paperwork, and then someone wiped the record. Officially, that visit never happened. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept seeing that figure in the veil, gliding through the gate like a shadow no one dared touch. I kept hearing the brittle laughter of the guards, the way it cracked at the edges. The next morning, I found a note tucked into my locker. No signature, no handwriting I recognized, just 4 words printed in plain block letters. "Forget what you saw. I got the message." I didn't bring it up again. Not to anyone. I filed the visitor logs as usual. I filed the incident reports as usual. I filed my fear somewhere deep enough it wouldn't show on my face. But sometimes, when I was walking past the shoe monitors late at night, I'd think about that visitor. Think about what it meant. You don't send someone like that to deliver good news. You send them when the stakes are bigger than the walls can hold. He said them when the myth needs preserving, no matter what gets buried under it. Chapter 4. The glitch that spoke. Most people think the cameras are always on, always perfect, always loyal. They think the red light means the truth is being recorded, stitched neatly into evidence that can be trusted. I used to believe that too, before MDC Brooklyn wore me down. Before I learned how easy it was for silence to slip between the frames. I worked surveillance longer than I care to admit. Nights mostly. Dead hours when the building seemed to hum under its own weight, when the old pipes rattled and the fluorescent lights buzzed like dying insects. My job wasn't glamorous, it was a grind. review hours of footage, flag anomalies, generate reports nobody read unless a lawsuit was involved. Most days it felt like stacking sand against the tide. The week I caught the glitch was supposed to be like any other. It started small. One blip on hallway camera 4D2 outside SUU. Static distortion lasting less than a second. Normally, that wouldn't even register on my checklist. Our system was patched together from a dozen government contracts and 3 decades of neglect. Glitches happened, we logged them, we shrugged, we moved on. But there was something about this one. It wasn't random. The timing was wrong. Right at 3:11 AM, dead middle of second shift lull, when most of the prison was breathing heavy with sleep. Right when the feed should have been clean. My market, curiosity more than anything else, and kept rolling through the week's files. That's when I noticed the second one. Different night, same hour. This time on stairwell camera 5S1. Another half second of static, thin and sharp like a crack splitting the screen, and then normal again. By the third glitch, I wasn't shrugging it off anymore. I printed out timestamps, cross-referenced shift schedules, mapped camera placements onto an old blueprint crammed in the back of the surveillance room filing cabinet, and what I found made my skin go cold. The glitches weren't random, they were a pattern. A broken line traced through the prison's veins, starting outside Diddy's SHU block, spiraling down through maintenance corridors and disused stairwells, ending in the lower service levels, specifically in a janitor closet near the abandoned freight elevator no one used anymore. Thought about reporting it. I really did. But I knew better. If you find something you're not supposed to find and you report it, you don't just lose your job here. You lose your safety. You lose the illusion that the system is blind and fair and bigger than any one man. So I kept digging. Quietly. It took me 4 nights to isolate the clearest frame from the glitches. It happened outside the service closet, timestamped at 3:16 AM. At first it looked like static, a blur of pixels and noise. But when I slowed the frame down, sharpened the contrast, layered filter after filter to peel back the noise, the shape came into focus. A hunched low, one hand extending through the cracked open janitor cart. Not trash, not a mop or a broom. A hand reaching back toward him, pale narrow fingers, and between them, a small folded object. Could have been paper, could have been a flash drive. Whatever it was, it disappeared into the cart and out of sight in less than a second. My throat went dry. He wasn't just pacing his cell, he wasn't just muttering into corners. He was communicating, moving messages, data, something right under the noses of guards, admin staff, surveillance teams. Invisible, because we were trained to look for violence, for weapons, for fights, for open rebellion. Nobody ever taught us to watch for the silent crimes, the ones that slipped between pixels and protocols. I copied the footage, not onto the work server, onto a personal thumb drive I kept hidden inside the lining of my jacket. I told myself it was insurance. I told myself it was curiosity. Truth was, I didn't know what I was going to do with it. I just knew I couldn't leave it sitting there, waiting to be buried. The next few days, I watched the monitors like a man possessed. Every flicker of static, every ripple across a grainy screen set my teeth on edge. I saw other guards ignoring it. Saw supervisors nodding along to reports they knew were half-written lies. And I started seeing patterns in the movement of the janitors, how certain carts lingered longer near the SHU corridor, how certain maintenance workers took smoke breaks that never showed on the logs, how entire wings of the prison were under maintenance during key night hours. It wasn't a prison anymore. It was a network. And Diddy, whatever else he was or wasn't, was still pulling strings through the cracks. The fear set in slow. Not the fear of getting caught exactly. The fear of realizing that everything I thought I understood about control, about containment, was wrong. We weren't locking him up. We were housing him, sheltering him while he rebuilt whatever empire he'd lost on the outside. I stopped sleeping right after that. I stopped trusting the shifts, stopped trusting the bland, smiling supervisors who handed down new visitor policies without explanation, stopped trusting the creaking walls that sounded like they whispered when the ventilation systems kicked on at night. One morning after a particularly bad night of footage review, a night when I saw 3 separate glitches along the same path, one after another, like a silent chain of signals, I found an envelope on my desk. No return address. No markings. Inside was a single printed page. Maintain chain of custody. Do not initiate inquiry. No threats. No signatures. Just orders, plain and clear. I burned the envelope in the alley dumpster behind the staff lot, watched the flame gutter and spit ash into the frozen air. I still have the thumb drive buried inside an old coffee can wedged into a crack in my apartment wall. I don't open it anymore. I don't need to. I already know what it shows. And I already know that when the walls hum at night, it's not the pipes. It's the messages still moving, stitched into the prison's bones, waiting for someone else to look too closely. Waiting for someone else to hear the glitch that spoke. Chapter 5. The Begging Hour. The summons came before dawn, slipped under my apartment door in a sealed white envelope. No call, no text, no courtesy notice. Just the kind of envelope you learn not to ignore when you work in the clerk's office at the federal courthouse. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Closed session, emergency proceeding, special case ID. No observers, mandatory attendance. Rather, I didn't ask questions. You didn't when it involved that case. Ever since Diddy's transfer to MDC, every motion, every filing, every whispered update came wrapped in heavier chains. His name wasn't even used anymore in internal memos, just the number, the case code. Like speaking it out loud might summon something nobody wanted in the building. When I got to the courthouse, it was barely light out. The halls were empty except for a few marshals posted outside the private courtroom, faces blank, eyes sharp. I showed my badge. They didn't say a word, just nodded me through. Inside, the room was colder than usual. The overhead lights dimmed down to a dull, sickly buzz. At the far end, perched high behind the bench, the judge waited, robes loose around his thin frame, face unreadable. Monitors stood on a rolling cart in the center of the floor, grainy video feed flickering to life. Diddy appeared on the screen like a ghost pulled from the bottom of a dirty river. He looked nothing like the man in the old videos, the magazine covers, the gala snapshots that used to splash across news feeds. His skin was sallow, almost gray. His eyes were red-rimmed and wild, darting around as if trying to find some invisible exit beyond the edges of the frame. His hands shook where they gripped the metal table bolted to the floor in his cell. The judge didn't say a word to start, just gave a small nod to the court reporter stationed at the corner, hand poised over her stenograph machine. Diddy leaned in closer to the camera, and for a moment I thought he might actually slam his forehead into the screen. "I need to speak," he said, voice raw and trembling. "I need to set the record straight." The judge gave no reaction. Diddy wiped sweat from his forehead with a trembling hand. The sweat kept coming anyway, soaking the collar of his beige prison jumper, clinging to his skin like a second suffocating layer. Meadle shrugged. "I know what they're saying," he choked out. I didn't. They set me up, you gotta understand. They hate me in there. The guards, the inmates, they feed lies into the cameras. They fake the tapes." His words stumbled over each other, frantic, chaotic. He would start one sentence, abandon it halfway through, jump to another. They got jealous. I built all this, I made them, and now they want to watch me fall. They paid people. Paid to plant things, to twist the feeds, to edit footage. He gripped the table harder, knuckles whitening. "I ain't no monster," he whispered. "I ain't what they say." The judge remained still, a stone carving in black robes, staring at the screen without blinking. Diddy's eyes darted again, as if he could sense the courtroom around him even through the distance, as if he knew we were watching, judging. "They put voices in my walls," he said suddenly, voice pitching higher, cracking at the edges. "They whisper at night, old names I forgot. They play songs backward in the pipes. They make it so you can't think straight." His breathing quickened, chest rising and falling in sharp, erratic bursts. "I can't sleep. I can't even dream right. I close my eyes and I see them. The ones I built, they turn their backs. They let me burn." He slammed a fist onto the table, a hollow metallic thud that made the monitor wobble slightly. "They made them," he roared, "and now they act like I'm a ghost, like I'm not even worth saving." For a moment the room felt like it cracked open. The sound of his voice, raw and wounded, bounced off the courtroom walls, hung there like smoke too thick to breathe. And then, as quickly as the rage had come, it melted away. Diddy slumped forward, pressing his forehead against the cool metal of the table. "I'm tired," he whispered. "I'm so damn tired." Silence stretched, long and brittle. Then, slowly, he lifted his head, eyes glassy, mouth trembling. "Please," he said. "Please, Your Honor. Mercy. Don't believe what you see. Don't believe the walls. They lie." The judge's face didn't change. Not a twitch, not a flicker of sympathy. Just the endless, heavy stare of a man who had heard 1,000 different flavors of the same desperate plea before. Diddy tried again, voice breaking like a child's. "I'm sick. I'm not right in the head. I need help. Not punishment. Help." He wiped at his nose with the sleeve of his jumper, smearing sweat and snot across the fabric. "I can't fix what they already decided I did. I can't make them forget. But I'm not the monster they painted." The feed crackled slightly, lines of static briefly washing across the monitor. The court reporter kept typing, the soft clatter of keys the only sound other than Diddy's broken breathing. The judge finally leaned forward slightly, hands folded neatly on the bench. He didn't speak, he didn't nod. He simply pressed a button on the side of his chair, signaling the session's recording had ended. Then he stood, his black robes flowing stiffly behind him, and left the courtroom without a word. Leading Diddy slumped there, still begging, still hoping the stone could bleed. I sat frozen in my chair, hands gripping the sides so tightly my fingers ached. The monitor flickered once more, then went dark. Filled over. For the record, the transcript would say nothing extraordinary happened that morning. It would be filed under emergency session review with a notation, inmate appeal for clemency, denied, no judicial comment. But those of us who sat in that courtroom knew better. We heard the cracking of a man who had built an empire on noise, now crushed under the unbearable weight of silence. We saw a king reduced to a whisper, clawing at the stone walls he used to command. And we knew, deep down, that no mercy was coming. Not from the judge, not from the system, and least of all from the walls themselves, which had been listening all along. Chapter 6. The footage that didn't fade. The package came in a battered manila envelope with no return address, no postmark, no fingerprint that could trace it back to whoever had risked everything to send it. It was just sitting there in my P.O. box one afternoon, tucked between junk flyers and a late notice from my electric company. Nothing special, nothing that screamed for attention. But the weight of it told a different story. Inside, wrapped in a layer of faded newspaper and static cling plastic, was a thumb drive. No label, no note. Just a piece of red thread knotted loosely around the middle. I knew better than to open it on a work terminal. I took it home, drew the curtains shut, unplugged my router, and booted up an old offline laptop I kept exactly for things like this. Stared at the blinking cursor for a long minute before I even plugged the drive in. The files were crudely organized, just a string of dates and timestamps stitched together into a rough video timeline. No audio cleanup, no editing. Raw, shaky, grainy, like someone had scraped them straight from the system with bloody fingernails. The first segment started slow, static, the familiar washed-out gray of prison hallways flickering under fluorescent lights. A janitor's cart rolling past a locked SHU door. Normal. Except the hand that slipped out from the side of the cart wasn't cleaning supplies. He was pale, twitching, reaching, on, passing something small and glinting into a waiting hand inside the cell. The timestamp told me it was 3 in the morning. The second segment showed another hallway, different angle, a figure hunched and wrapped in standard issue prison garb, tapping once, twice, 3 times against a vent shaft before slipping a rolled piece of paper into the grill. Less than a minute later, a different inmate, eyes downcast, shuffled past and plucked it free without breaking stride. The third clip was worse. In this one, the figure was unmistakable. Diddy, pacing his cell, glancing up at the fixed camera lens without fear. He waited until the tier guard passed, then knelt by the far wall, his body blocking most of the view, but just enough angle remained to catch his hand moving furiously against the concrete with what looked like a smuggled marker. Symbols, not words. Sharp angles. Circles inside circles. Lines branching out like roads or blood vessels. He finished quickly, stood, and before the next round scrubbed at the marks with a ragged strip of cloth until nothing visible remained. But when I zoomed in, brightened the frame, I could still see faint shadows under the scrubbed surface. He hadn't erased them. He'd simply buried them deeper. The footage wasn't consistent. Sometimes the glitches were so bad whole sections became static Cs. Sometimes there were gaps, whole minutes gone as if eaten by the building itself. But whoever pieced it together had done it carefully enough to reveal a pattern. Meetings. Exchanges. Communications passed hand to hand under the noses of guards and cameras. A network, alive and pulsing under the concrete skin of MBC Brooklyn. Halfway through the file set, the audio cut in, warped and stuttering, barely coherent. At first, just the hum of ancient ventilation, the metallic groan of a building too old for its purpose. But layered under that, like the whisper of a razor against a throat, was a voice. Faint, reversed, scrambled. I spent hours isolating it, looping it, running it through crude editing filters. Finally, one phrase emerged, broken but chillingly clear. The thrones don't move without blood. I sat back from the laptop, heart hammering against my ribs. It wasn't just a warning. The map, a manual for survival in a kingdom built on silence and sacrifice. I went through the footage 3 more times that night, marking patterns, tracing symbols, matching faces when I could. Many of the figures were blurred, their features lost in the smeared gray soup of low-grade security feeds. But a few, here and there, flickered into clarity. Inmates, staff, faces I had seen before in court filings and news articles. Faces tied to old rumors, to scandals swept neatly under government rugs. This wasn't about a single man losing his mind inside a crumbling prison. This was about what he still carried in his head, and what he might unleash if he ever found the right door to open. The footage ended without ceremony. The last clip showed Diddy seated cross-legged on the floor of his cell, staring directly into the camera. His mouth moved slowly, forming words the microphones couldn't catch. He smiled, thin and cold, and then the screen went black. I unplugged the thumb drive, wrapped it back in the newspaper, and buried it inside a hollowed-out book on my shelf. I didn't sleep that night, couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him sitting there, waiting, smiling. I knew better than to run the story right away. It needed to be framed carefully, layered in speculation, shielded with third-hand sourcing and plausible deniability. It needed to look like rumor, like madness. Otherwise, it would never see the light of day. And even then, I wasn't sure light was what it needed. Some truths don't come into the world clean. Some are born bloody and broken, clawing their way into the spaces we try to keep safe. By the time the sun rose, staining the sky the color of dried rust, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever empire Diddy had ruled before was gone. Whatever thrones he had built were cracking, splintering under the weight of their own rot. But the blood they demanded? That debt hadn't been paid yet. Not even close. Chapter 7. The Delta Wing. I'd been locked down in SHU longer than most of the guards had been wearing their badges. Long enough to know the patterns, the rhythms, the little lies the walls told when nobody else was listening. Long enough to know when something wasn't just another bad night behind bars. The night Diddy disappeared, it was like the whole block stopped breathing. No warning, no call-outs, no loud arguments with the guards, just gone. One minute you could hear him pacing the floor like he always did, that slow scrape of socked feet dragging across concrete. Then, somewhere between the third and fourth count, his cell was empty. Not open, just silent. No movement, no sound. We weren't supposed to talk to each other, not officially. SHU is isolation, designed to chew you up inside your own head. But some of us learned to communicate anyway. A scrap of mirror angled just right. A tap sequence on the pipes. A muttered word passed between the cracks when the guards weren't paying close enough attention. By morning, the rumors were already circling like vultures. "Hell, we moved him to Delta," someone whispered through the vent. "And a wing." Most places didn't have one, not officially. It wasn't on the intake maps or the emergency evacuation plans. But everybody who'd spent enough time buried deep in federal holes like this had heard the stories. Delta wasn't for the violent ones. It wasn't for the troublemakers or the escape risks. It was for the ones they couldn't afford to have seen or heard. There was no transfer paperwork, no announcement over the PA. His number was still listed in the daily roll sheet, like some cruel joke. But the guards who usually dragged trays past his cell barely even glanced at the empty slot where his door had been. We understood what that meant. They weren't pretending he was still there for us. They were pretending he had never been. For a long time after he showed up at MDC, a lot of the guys treated Diddy like some kind of myth walking among us. Like maybe being famous made you bulletproof, even inside these rotten walls. Some thought he had juice left, lawyers who could get him out, friends who would lean on judges, call in markers, smooth it all over. But the longer he stayed, the more the shine came off him. We saw him unravel piece by piece. Saw the sleepless pacing, saw the wild eyes, heard the muttering that sometimes rose up through the vents like prayers said backward. It wasn't long before we understood something even uglier. He wasn't a king in here. He was a liability. The kind of liability that made the people who mattered nervous. The kind that could open his mouth one day, in court, in an interview, hell, even in a midnight confession to some janitor with a good memory, and pull down more than just himself. And that made him dangerous in a way fists and shanks never could. It was the solution. I heard from a guy 2 cells down, an old-timer who said he worked kitchen detail back in the day. That Delta wasn't even a real wing. It was a space behind a space, an old storage block converted after some quiet memo nobody ever saw. No cameras, no visitors, no hope of getting bumped into someone on accident. You go there, he said, tapping the pipe for emphasis, and you don't come back unless they want you to. And I didn't know if Diddy was dead, drugged, or just buried so deep he might as well have been. Didn't matter. Either way, he was erased. Over the next few days, the tension on the block tightened like a noose. Guards got quieter, angrier, like they were carrying around secrets too heavy to hide well. Food trays came later, slopped together without care. Counts ran faster, faces less interested in confirming whether we were breathing or not. It was like the whole place was holding its breath, waiting for some hammer to fall that never quite came. The few of us left who still passed word between cells didn't speak Diddy's name anymore. Not out of loyalty, but of survival. It was safer to pretend he'd never been there. Safer to let the myth die the way they wanted it to. Some nights, though, when the pipes rattled and the walls shook with the hum of the old building settling into its slow rot, I wondered if he was still down there, somewhere deeper than even we could imagine. He wondered if he was pacing new walls, drawing new symbols, whispering new deals into the cracks. Wondered if Delta was a tomb or just another throne carved out of darkness and desperation. They thought burying him would be enough. All thought silence could erase the kind of knowledge that clung like mold to the bones of this place. But some stains don't fade. Some ghosts don't stop whispering. And in a place like this, where the air tastes like old secrets and regret soaks into the floors, you learn quick. You can move a man off the block. You can lock a door no key was meant to open. But you can't kill what he already set loose. Not here. Not in the Delta, Chapter 8. The walls remember. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. The collapse came in slow drips, like water leaking through a crack in the ceiling, warping the floorboards until one morning the whole room caves in. At first, there were whispers behind closed doors, quiet resignations filed under vague, personal reasons, emergency meetings called in the dead hours between midnight and dawn. Diddy's legal team, once swollen with high-profile names and polished suits, began to crumble. First, the junior associates disappeared, then the senior partners. Finally, even the spokespeople who had once sworn their loyalty in front of flashing cameras faded into silence, filing emergency motions to withdraw representation, citing irreconcilable conflicts and ethical concerns they refused to elaborate on. No one announced it officially. No press conferences, no final grandstanding exit from the spotlight. They simply left, slipped away like rats abandoning a sinking ship that had sprung leaks no one could patch. The footage, that cursed footage, stitched together in secrecy and desperation, made its way into court records not through public trial, but through sealed evidentiary submissions. Even then, it arrived mutilated, redacted, whole frames blurred beyond recognition, audio tracks cut into jagged shards of noise. But the truth has a way of bleeding through even the thickest black ink. Enough slipped through for those who needed to know. Enough to bury the myth. Hollywood, once a glittering fortress that shielded its favored sons, turned its back in silence. Contracts quietly terminated. Syndication deals dissolved without public comment. Companies that had built empires from his image purged their archives in the middle of the night. Rebranding campaigns, scrubbing names from press releases, pulling merchandise from shelves as if history itself could be steam cleaned away. Nobody wanted to say it out loud. Nobody wanted to admit how much they had known, how many signs had been politely ignored for years, how many rumors had been papered over with sponsorships and glowing headlines. It was easier to pretend it had happened all at once, that he had simply unraveled overnight. But the walls remembered. It remembered every whispered deal brokered behind closed doors, every hush payment signed with shaking hands, every glance averted when the wrong questions were asked. It wasn't the loud accusations that brought the empire down. It wasn't the furious headlines or the viral exposés. It was the little things, the symbols scrubbed halfway into concrete, the blank calls stitched into midnight hours, the silent footage that didn't fade, even after they tried to bury it. The myth didn't collapse under the weight of one great scandal. It bled out slowly, death by 1,000 invisible cuts, each one made by a hand that once claimed to love him. And in the end, when the doors to the courtroom swung shut for the final time and the world moved on to fresher stories, it wasn't his name that lingered. It was the rot, the heavy, clinging stench of a legacy too rotten to preserve, too foul to erase cleanly. Somewhere, tucked deep in the archives of a journalist too stubborn to back down, the final note sat folded between stacks of sealed documents and anonymous tips. A simple line, scrawled in ink that still hadn't fully dried. But mercy belongs to the ones who leave clean footprints. His were engraved. The walls had listened. The walls had watched. And long after the lights dimmed and the headlines faded and the last lawyers signed their last desperate motions, the walls would still remember. Because in the end, it wasn't the kings who wrote history. It was the stones beneath their feet, waiting patiently for them to fall.